Now, this paper is offering an ontology of the senses, and it's been stimulated by recent work that looks at the ontology of art and looks at art's social or ecological bearing, particularly with a view to how the work of art itself might undergo change, become more social, become more participatory. But I think a lot of that work overlooks the senses, doesn't pay attention to the ontology of the senses. And that when an artist is making, when you're making with representation, expression, any form of work, that making introduces certain levels of complexity, and these complexities are very interesting for ontology. So I'll be surveying briefly this other work, but focusing on Merleau-Ponty and Cézanne, certainly one of the most popular collections of painting in aesthetics. And I'll be thinking of lots of asides and references to squeaks, creaks, and the value of this hopefully will be to just look at the scope of the senses, the aesthetic, and what impact aesthetics might have on other discourses. Is this legible? So, can an understanding be formed of how sensory experience might be presented or manipulated in visual art in order to promote what I'm calling a relational concept of the senses understood as relations. This is going to be in opposition to the customary, arguably capitalist notion of sensation as a private possession, an impression, a thing, something that is mine. This project, answering this question, could be construed as trying to formulate aesthetics as ecology, with ecology understood in two senses. One, how we understand our relationship to the environment, our being in the world. But also, I think there's a wider sense of ecology as the study of relationship, what it means to belong, what it means to have a relationship with an other, where the other might be a thing, people, environment. And I'm getting that from the idea of ecology being the study of home, where one dwells, where one feels where one belongs. And in looking at the senses, we can see two elements here. The senses, distinct from their notion of sense data or impressions, they are our means of engagement and contact with the world. And also, we have to ask what belongs to the senses. How do we demarcate them? How do we draw a boundary around them? Because as soon as you start to look at the senses, you very quickly bang up against notions of belonging. In philosophy, there's always looking at the senses as how they are attributed. With direct realism, we assume that sensory properties inhere in objects, they belong to objects. Or with indirect realism, let's create some intermediaries. Let's have a creak. Perfect example. A creak is not in the door, nothing else, it's this intermediary sense data of a creak. Thank you, door. Within that, kind of problematizing this distinction between direct and indirect realism is where we understand, or how we understand primary and secondary qualities. Qualities that are again in the object, or secondary that we're not quite sure where secondary qualities that can change through perception, like heat or colour, where do we put those? So notions of belonging deeply affect the senses. There's also the problem of focus, which I shall come to in the second slide. My My interest in this subject has arisen from work done by these thinkers looking at the social stroke ecological capacity of art. There's a number of positions here. Arnold Berleant trying to think how notions of ecology and environment might be applied to the artwork. So he asks us to think of the work of art as an environment, the painting as an environment, the sculpture as an environment. And it's not until quite late, very late in his work, that he actually thinks about, can art itself, having been understood in its own terms as an environment, have some bearing on environmental critical thought. But so far he's primarily looking at the work of art as an environment. Again, not looking at the senses. Bourriaud and Kester, they both, in different ways, are looking at the work of art as a social practice. Artworks that are not paintings or sculptures, and arguably not even installations, but artworks that involve administrations, social agencies, commissions with public bodies. Crowther has coined the notion of an ecological theory of art, but this is a very broad brush term, simply his term for looking at aesthetics in the Kantian or the phenomenological tradition, i.e. art is understood as something that has importance for how we understand the subject-world relationship. So, although there is ecological interest, no one is focusing on the senses. Figure who is very important here is recent work on the distribution of the sensible. Rancière, who argues that sensory experience is always already bound up in political discourse. And he will acknowledge there is a certain Kantian thesis at work there in his essay, Distribution of the Sensible. So that whenever we have a sensory encounter, we should attend to the categories, the structures that are at work, and that. However, his analysis and the examples he gives, he's talking about categories of work, in particular the notion of the importance that surface has acquired in modernism, but we don't get with Rancière to look at particular surfaces. It is the surface as a category, I would argue. So although we have the beginnings of a thesis that tries to argue for the political significance of the sensible, it's very much tied down to certain categories of art. My perspective is to go with, pick up a very brief passage from Marx in Private Property and Communism, where he says capitalism reduces all senses to the sense of having, and he includes the five senses in that. That our senses are primarily relational, but capitalism turns it into, I have that experience. This is something which is mine, and he says that this is what we need to work against, but again, his project is not an aesthetic one. Marcuse, in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, actually picks up on this and says that there may be the germ of an ecological radical sensibility in picking up on Marx's suggestion, but again, Marcuse doesn't follow through on that. So this is, Marx and Marcuse are my are the figures I'm taking my lead from. But before we go any further, there is a problem, and that is, it's very hard to actually refer to the senses, to individuate them, to talk about them, because as soon as you do so, you start introducing certain vocabulary. They even talk about pure red or a pure sound. What's purity doing here? It's hard to find a vocabulary that we can call true or what belongs to the senses. What is sensation's own language? Gilbert Ryle says we have no neat sensation vocabulary. We can talk of colours, sounds, beyond that we have no sensation vocabulary. We're always drawing on other things. We talk about the sound of a motorbike, the squeak of a door, although possibly squeak is a word we could refer to as onomatopoeia. Is onomatopoeia a dimension of sensory language entering into language? So the fact that whenever we refer to the senses, there's always somehow an impure, muddy reference taking place. This is something that cannot be avoided and something I would argue is actually quite valuable later on. So just to rephrase the question, kind of sharpen it up slightly based on the survey just given. Is it possible for the senses as conceptualized, the senses already as these things that are written on, theorized, to be manipulated within visual art in the interest of promoting the relational nature? I think for those familiar with aesthetics, certainly phenomenological aesthetics, these paintings by Cézanne are probably one of the most studied and theorized series of works in this subject. I felt slightly guilty about that, but there is a reason for that, and a very specific ontological project at work in Merleau-Ponty, which I'm going to build on. But Merleau-Ponty, in his writings on aesthetics, refers to these works and cites them as being vital because he says that they are not representations. They are not representations. These works are important because, to use his word, they are autofigurative. They're somehow about bringing themselves into being. We should see them as things that bring themselves into being and not as windows on the world, not as depictions of a landscape in a conventional sense. What does he mean by that? And to quote from Iron Mind, the painting relates to nothing at all among experienced things. So it's not a reference, it's not a correspondence, unless it is first of all auto-figurative. It is a spectacle of something only by being a spectacle of nothing, by breaking the skin of things to show how things become things, how the world becomes world. The world's instant is still held toward us by his painting. The claim here is that in these works, what we're seeing is not an artist trying to accurately record a landscape, but we see an embodied performance. We see the painting coming into being. We see the artist with his body moving around the landscape, trying to effect something on a canvas. It's not a painting before the world, but part of the world. It is, brackets, a record of, close brackets, its own coming into being, including its being viewed by others. Go into a bit more detail on this. The phrases in brackets and the question of whether they should be in brackets are decisive. In one sense, the painting is a record of Cézanne's embodied activity. He is moving around the canvas, he is struggling to look, looking here, looking there, shifting attention. But in another, more figurative sense, it is not, for it endures as an arrangement of paint on a surface, as a piece of continuously active technology at the centre of the interaction between artist, mountain, and audience. The fact that the dabs of paint coalesce to look like a mountain is not an additional feature which has to be explained in the style of attempts by aesthetics to explain how a picture can correspond to an object. Since Cézanne's arrangement of paint on the canvas, how one brushstroke sits in relation to another, and our perception of it already constitute the network of relationships that defines what the painting is from the point of view of Merleau-Ponty's aesthetics. The work, in the lattice work of senses, bodily joints, negotiations between space and flat canvas, and colour distribution that defines the appearance of the mountain is already present in the painting, not as a property, but as an original and continuously active relationship that extends to include Cézanne and ourselves. What we see at work in this read by Merleau-Ponty is his philosophy of embodiment, the idea that appearances, sensations are not isolated data, but elements that always are pointing on towards other aspects of bodily experience. This is a key property of how he defines the body. It's not a flesh and bone container of a self, but a network of relationships whereby an individual agent is allowed to maneuver themselves around the world. In this sense, an image is not a surface, not a representation, but a state of embodiment, a constellation, to use one of Merleau-Ponty's terms. And he brings this out in a later essay, one of his final pieces, The Intertwining, where he talks about the experience of work. This red is what it is only by connecting up from its place with other reds about it, with which it forms a constellation, and with other colours that dominate or which dominate it, that it attracts or that attract it, that it repels or that repel it. In short, it's a certain node in the woof of a simultaneous and successive. It is a concretion of visibility. It is not an atom. So, with Merleau-Ponty, I would argue we find a very particular ontology of the senses, the senses as relationships within his philosophy of embodiment, the senses not as atoms, not as discrete, but as differential, relational properties. And Cézanne figures prominently for Merleau-Ponty and for myself because of this. Well, how would we characterize this work? Why is it doing the work that Merleau-Ponty wants to claim that it does? I would say there's almost an incompleteness to it. And I have used the word before, dabs. Not a very polite word, dabs. Cézanne loved the dabs. Sounds a bit kind of cack-handed, a bit unthought. But I would want to argue here that it's that very almost brutish, slightly unconsidered, slightly incomplete property that is valuable here, because it's this incompleteness, this unfinishedness, this always, that's not quite a house, let's move on somewhere else, this constant moving on property that the strokes have, which is valuable in drawing attention to the relations that Merleau-Ponty wants to define as the body. Let's check the time. Is it 10 minutes?
5 minutes.
See what I did there? I said 10, it's compared to 5. Does this mean then that if I want to be considering an idea of a sensitive relational, I'm committed to saying to artists, the value of this is that we can perhaps offer sensory forms that promote relational experience, the senses as being this interactive, relational condition in the world, that you have to work like Cézanne. There's a very particular style here, and you are compelled to do that. What would that be like? Just that having a survey of, could we see correlates in other ways of working? 2 examples, which are of different respects of similarity. Hockney with the camera, you can see with the, well, you actually can't see that clearly. Lower this. hopefully moving with the camera, a collage of various shots, but arguably still serving the interest of representation. There is an attempt to write a complete picture, or John Stezeker, who is looking for different ways in which the world of a photograph can be corrupted, or some similarities can also corrupt. But I think this question of, are we bound to working in a Cézanne-like way, needs to challenge the idea of there being a Cézanne-like way. It objectifies style, as if we can say this is Cézanne's style, but I think style plays a different role in Merleau-Ponty's aesthetics. It's not something that is tied, it's not possession, it's not tied to a person. It plays an ontological role. It's down to the way in which certain aspects of the body impinge upon one another. And he'll talk about, say, the style of someone walking, how someone's way of walking as a style manifests itself through a sequence of transformations or transpositions, as in the way in which a person's walk is revealed in the click of a heel. So even a click can itself move on to a certain quality. And with Cézanne, what I'm arguing is that rather than focusing on particular depictions of landscape, it's this idea of how one property moves into another, how one state of the body moves into another. Although we might think of style as an object, a signature, a way of being that we're in charge of and can reproduce at will, it operates ontologically from Merleau-Ponty as the way entities, not just humans, because we'll talk about the tension of the bone being present in the fibre of the wood. So even objects can display style, carry themselves in the world. It operates ontologically in the way things carry themselves in the world, with all the properties and manners they exhibit and actions they conduct or facilitate occurring as elements signifying their conformity towards other things. An object and a technology can be said to have a style inasmuch as they lend themselves to certain ways of being. With the crucial phrase there being to lend themselves. Style is always lending itself to another way of being. So, the relational nature of the senses I'm proposing starts out from this notion of autofiguration, Merleau-Ponty, of a work of art that tries to be about itself, where that being aboutness, that record of production is expressed through the intersecting styles of the different elements within the work, where style is the manner where one element lends itself to another. Certain problems with this, the prevalence of the prefix auto, the way a work is about itself. Isn't there a tension here between a work being about itself, but I'm arguing that I'm looking at relationships between one thing going beyond itself to another. And in response, we could change the term. Maybe auto-figurative is not the best term, but I think what it highlights is that if you do try to look at the work of art itself, if you are making, if you've got a choice, you've got a sheet of paper and a mark-making device, we tend to think of that being the work itself. But actually, already you've got a very complex relational set of questions before you, because pen on smooth paper, charcoal on rough paper, charcoal on smooth paper will set up a whole different set of choices for the artist and will allow a whole different set of marks and properties to emerge. So this notion of a work of art coming into being, we should not get too taken by the work of art itself, because there are these questions of the production of the material, the relationship between charcoal and smooth paper, charcoal and rock paper, how I hold those things, how I react with paper, that will start this whole stylistic matrix of one thing lending itself to another, and all the various lendings that might take place. Just some other questions for my position. Have we got, is it?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. If autofiguration, if that sense of autonomous, of self-generation is too strong, possibly perhaps the idea of predisposition, where the disposition, having this prior situation always to change position, might be more appropriate. What kind of movements are we talking about? I've called them here conceptual-sensory movements, the way one element might lend itself to another. How do we understand this conceptual-sensory movement? Conceptual-sensory, referring back to the problem at the start, where the senses are always already written on and theorized conceptualized. Should we be looking at trying to make the greatest leaps possible, those stylistic practices that create the greatest, possibly metaphorical leap from one property to a certain meaning? Being based in an art school, the context where I see it most strongly is where working with artists, often they'll be